All right. Well, good morning, New Life. Good to see everybody. I know we've already done a raffle and all that kind of thing, but I just want to start this morning. Shout out to dads. It's a big job, man. Between bringing home, going to job every morning, bringing home, being the breadwinner, if you will, being the guy who scares away the monsters, teaches you to ride your bike, sits out and sweats to death at ball practices. Man, we just want to say we appreciate you guys and all that you do for the families in our church. So shout out there. If you've missed a couple weeks or maybe it's your first time, we're in the middle of a series on Elijah and Elisha. This is week 6, week 2 on Elisha. So I want to just take a couple minutes, get you caught up to where we are. Elisha and Elijah, they're a couple of Old Testament prophets in 1st and 2nd Kings, that time frame. And they're sort of like a team, if you will. Elijah, he's the wise old guy. He's the mentor. Elisha, he's the mentee. For those of you sci-fi nerds, Elijah is the Jedi and Elisha is the Padawan. He's teaching him. He's sort of passing the mantle on. And last week, Pastor Brandon walked us through Elisha's call into ministry. He told us about the story of Elijah showing up, calling Elisha. Now, Elisha, he was a farmer. And there's a lot of adjectives, a lot of words you could use to describe these guys. And the one we worked off of last week was crazy. See, Elisha, he had a lot of cows, a lot of plows, and that's what he did for a living. Worked the ground, and when Elijah showed up, called him into ministry gave him God's call, and slaughtered all his cows and burned all of his plows. He went all in. It was a crazy thing. He took away any alternative that he would have. In case things got bad, he didn't have anything to fall back on. And so that's what we did last week. We killed some cows, we burned some plows, and we talked about just how crazy this guy actually was, and the fact that crazy is something that we're called to. It's funny, Elisha, he says to Elijah, hey, I want to do twice what you did. Now, if you know much about Elijah, that's crazy. We're talking about a dude who had a showdown with 400 prophets of Baal, 400 versus 1. That's not good numbers. We're talking about a guy who God saw fit, not even to let him die. He called him up in a tornado of fire to heaven. And then you got Elisha saying, I'm going to double that up. I'm going to do twice that much. We would say, his entire life, if that's the case, and as you read through, that actually will be the case in Elisha's life, that he's gone from crazy to a fanatic. He's just way out there on the limb. He's upgraded from crazy. Half the people in here are already calling the shrink. They're like, this guy needs to get his head checked out. But it's a perfect example because Pastor Brandon pointed out last week that if we want to really grab a hold of God's plan for our lives, that we're going to have to take a step away from our security in order to move towards our destiny. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take another step forward. We're going to move even further out of our comfort zone, because I can tell you, if you were up here and I said the word fanatical, like half the church was like, "Oh gosh, we can't. Don't say that." Like it's got a negative stigma about it. And so we're gonna deal with that this morning, and in the process, we're going to talk about being fanatical in an effort to chase God's desire, not only in our own lives, but for our church, for our families, for our children. And so that's where we're going to be. If you have, whatever you use, a Bible, an iPad, a phone, we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 3, starting in verse 9, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I just want to catch you up to where we are, what's happened in between. So what we've got going on is we're about to drop in the middle of a battle scene. And you've got 3 kingdoms on one side, and that's the side we're going to be reading the perspective from. And then you've got tiny little Moab. So these 3 kings, they've ganged up. They're trying to pull a sneak attack on this kingdom of Moab, just basically wipe them out. But they've hit a snag in their plans. And so that's sort of where we're gonna drop in. So if you're there, we're going to go ahead and pick up in verse 9. And it says, so the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom set out. After they had traveled their indirect route for 7 days, they had no water for their army or their animals. So they're trying to pull a sneak attack. They're trying to go around the flank, if you will, for army terms. And they've hit a big problem. They don't have any water. That's a huge deal. And so we're going to see what's going to happen here. So the king of Israel said, oh no, the Lord has summoned these 3 kings only to hand them over to Moab. But Jehoshaphat said, isn't there a prophet of the Lord here? Let's inquire of Yahweh through him. And And one of the servants of the king of Israel answered, Elisha, who used to pour water on Elijah's hands, is here. Jehoshaphat affirmed, the Lord's words are with him. So the three kings went to him. However, Elisha said to Joram of Israel, we have nothing in common. Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. But the king of Israel replied, no, because it's the Lord who has summoned these three kings to hand them over. And Elisha responded, as the Lord of hosts lives, I stand before him. If I did not have respect for the king of Judah, I would not look at you, and I wouldn't take notice of you. Now bring me a musician. While the musician played, the Lord's hand came on Elisha. Then he said, this is what the Lord says. Dig ditch after ditch in this valley. For the Lord says, you will not see wind nor rain, but the valley will be filled with water, and you will drink, and your animals and your cattle. This is easy in the Lord's sight, and he will also hand Moab over to you. Now, what we've got going on, it seems to be a situation where these guys, these three kings, they've got this grand plan, this grand scheme. They stacked the deck in their favor. I mean, it's 3 versus 1. I don't know if you guys have ever been 3 versus 1 in anything. My mind automatically goes to basketball. 3 versus 1 that's not a good thing. You're outnumbered, and you're going to be tired. You're going to be worn out. You're basically going to get destroyed. But what I notice is, as they stack the deck, it seems to be just the smallest detail has ruined their plans. I mean, water is just a basic necessity, right? But they don't have any. And it becomes sort of an afterthought until you run out, until you're starting to get dehydrated. And what I see this morning is like, even in man's strongest point, the smallest of hiccups can bring out our weakness in us. It can point out the flaws. And the reason I think this is here is because these guys are so caught up in what's going to be a glorious victory that they forget to plan for the basics. Right? Any army commander worth their salt knows, I got to feed my troops and I got to give them water. It's just basic common sense. And I think they were so caught up in what they were going to gain that they had this foolishness that they got distracted. And that's what I want to start with this morning, that oftentimes in our fleshly desires, our fleshly plans, we end up looking foolish. That's point 1, foolish flesh. See, I think that's where we operate day in and day out. That's where these guys are. And all of a sudden, they've hit this snag, and what's their response? Well, surely the Lord has delivered us. Right? We're real happy to take the credit for all our effort and hard work and planning when things are going great. But as soon as something goes bad, it's automatically got to be God's fault. Like, I'm blown away by how much this looks like our own lives. I'm blown away by the fact that these guys can't just simply see that maybe they're in a bad spot because of a poor decision they made, because they failed to plan adequately. Like, God forbid we take some responsibility for what we've done and where that's led us. But no, it must be God's fault. And that's sort of what they're saying. You know, we forgot to plan for a basic necessity. But man, it's got to be God's fault. Now let me explain a little bit, because if you remember back to Elijah, firstly, they're in a desert. There's not a whole lot of water in a desert to begin with. And secondly, it's the country has been in a drought for a really long time. If you remember back, Elijah said, it's not going to rain unless I tell it to rain. So you would think a group of people living in the Middle East, walking through a desert, who have been experiencing a drought for a very long time, would think ahead a little bit and bring some water. But just like us, what looks stupid from the backside, like, that's just dumb, that's ignorant, that's foolish, they want to blame on God. They want to put the blame at His feet. And then to sort of build on that, it's sort of like they never really learned their lesson, which is really so applicable in my life. Because, see, this is the same wilderness that the Israelites wandered in when they refused to enter the Promised Land. It's the same wilderness where Moses had to take and strike a rock with his staff to provide water for people who were about to die of dehydration. I can imagine God like, really? You're not getting this? Like, you've been in this place. You've suffered this same thing. You think you would pick up on it. And sometimes I wonder if He doesn't look at my life and be like, really? you don't get it. And we consistently live in this manner that I would label as faithless. Yet we constantly expect God to be faithful. I mean, isn't that ultimately what they're asking? Ultimately, they're saying, we don't really worship you. We're going to worship you along with all these little g gods. And he says, but now that I'm in trouble, I need you to bail me out. And it's funny, I love what Elisha says. He's like, hey, why don't you go talk to Baal and see if he can bail you out, because I don't have anything in common with you. Right? He's saying, why on earth would you expect to follow the flesh and then have God be faithful? But see, here's the beautiful thing about this that's going to take like what starts out as a real negative and turns it into a positive. See, no matter how faithlessly you're living, God's still in the business of turning around train wrecks through his faithfulness. See, Elisha says, hey, the only reason I'm listening is because the king of Judah. You know what the king of Judah did that garners this favor? All he did was take down a couple Baal statues that were being worshipped at the time. Nothing real major. But God says, hey, I'm still willing to come through. And so what we're going to see this morning is it's going to take a big shift for these guys. They're going to have to do something that's crazy. They're going to have to do something way out there, and they're going to have to completely change their whole perspective. And I think for us this morning, we have the same message. We're going to require an overhaul here. An overhaul here. We're going to require such a reset that it's going to look beyond crazy. People are going to begin to label us as fanatics. There's that word again, fanatic. Sort of puts us on edge, doesn't it? And the reason is because we're gonna have to demonstrate a faith, one that defies logic, one that defies conventional wisdom. And so the second point this morning that I see is, if we're going to get to the point where we can begin to experience God's faithfulness, fanatical faith requires a reset. Now, what do I mean by this? In motion students, stay with me for a minute, because you heard a little section of this Sunday night if you were here. I notice, despite the foolishness of their situation, these armies, they actually have a legitimate need. I mean, sure, they may have put themselves in a bad spot, but water is a necessity. It's legitimate. And so maybe in your own life, maybe you've taken a situation and you've made it worse. Or maybe you're just sitting here saying, hey, I legitimately have some stuff I need, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. Whichever of those it may be, and in my experience, that can change from day to day. I think we need to start our reset with a change in mindset, a change in perspective, one that says the way we look at suffering may be wrong. See, I think oftentimes we see suffering as a punishment from God. And I think that's wrong. I think we need to step back and look at it from a further point of view and say, suffering may not be a punishment. Suffering is not something God is doing to me, but rather an opportunity God is using to do something in or through me. Like, you understand that? Like, sometimes suffering is our own fault, and sometimes it just happens because of the world we live in and the broken creation that we are a part of. But rather than looking at it as punishment, look at it as an opportunity for God to either refine you or impact someone else. It's a big change. All of a sudden, it's not punishment, it's opportunity. See, that takes a big reset. That takes a willingness to step back and say, what hurts me the most may actually be a good thing. Because what I want to suggest to you this morning is that your greatest need can become your greatest blessing when it drives you to depend on God. The thing that hurts you the most can be one of the best things in your life when it teaches you reliance on Him. That's not comfortable to hear. That's not something we necessarily want to hear, sitting out here, in our seats, in our comfortable security zones. But remember, we're stepping out of those security zones. We're going farther and farther from that. And I think we're going to have to take, because that's a mindset reset, we're going to have to take that and make it a heart reset. See, there's this like weird spot in here where it says, Elisha calls a musician. To me, that was really awkward, right in the middle of his situation. But there's a reason for it. See, Elisha's ticked. I mean, if he was using my lingo today, his first response would be what my t-shirt says. You're killing me, Smalls. Like, come on, people. Come on, guys. You have made your own bed. Now you got to lay in it. Right? He even brings up your mom jokes. He's like, why don't you go talk to your mom's God? Like that, Elijah he's ticked. And so what does he do? He says, okay. He says, before I try to talk to God, I'm going to have to change some things because right now I'm so mad. Like parents, you ever been so mad at your kids, you just got to walk away? Because if not, you're going to be like one kid less. Amen. Yeah. And that's what Elisha's like. He's like, man, I just want to like strangle all three of you. So he calls in and this musician starts playing, and it's because he realizes that his heart is not focused where it should be. He realizes that right now his heart is not focused on the worship of God. And that's what I want to say this morning, that we're going to have to not only reset our mindset, we're going to have to reset our lives into a lifestyle of worship. So we got to understand, worship is not something we do on Sunday mornings when the band is up here. Worship is a way of living that honors God at all times. And so Elisha says, I need that reset because being in the right mindset, having my spirit focused on worship allows me to talk to God and allows me to clearly hear God. So we got to reset our lifestyle, folks. We got to stop chasing the world and stop focusing on that and stop leaving God at church and begin to take one and says, okay, if God really is my all, it's time to reset and focus my spirit on what is supposedly my all. But I want to debunk this negative stigma because every time I say fanatic, I still see some people like flinch, right? Because fanatic, when you talk about it in the church, man, that's not a good thing. That's the guy like you refuse to sit on the same row with them. If you see him at Walmart, like you're like running the other direction, go, right? Telling your kids, go down that aisle, go down that, like split, scatter. You don't want to talk to them. It might get uncomfortable. It might get convicting. Or they take on the term Bible beaters. You guys heard that term before, right? It's just not a good thing to be referred to within the church. But see, I have a problem with that because I think if we take that same zeal, that same drive outside of the church and put it in cultural things, it becomes celebrated. Let me explain. So you've got a guy who, like, he goes to a parking lot, like 10 hours before he has to be anywhere. And this guy, he's got his shirt off. Mind you, a guy who should never have his shirt off in public in the first place. He's got his chest painted. He's got a letter on it. Wearing this stupid hat. Running around, yelling, acting like he's like 8. Half the time, him and his buddies can't even get the letters in the right order. You know what I mean? And it's like 10 degrees and it's snowing. That's a passionate fan. Man, for that, you'll get on national television multiple times in a game. Or my sister, so no booze, she is a massive NC State fan. Now, my sister graduated from NC State. She's got valid reasons to be an NC State fan. Well, y'all ever had one of those people you just cannot watch a ball game with? Like, I'm telling you, the house she used to rent, the floor is worn out from her pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. She like beat on the floor. She screams at the TV. I'm like, Aaron, they can't hear you. He knows he dropped the ball. It's okay. A whole wall shrine, like floor to ceiling, fat heads. Man, she's nuts about it. But it's passion. Or let's step even further back and hit somewhere that really hits home. You got a family, their kids, he's all right at baseball. He's 6, 7 years old. Family spends a fortune going into debt, traveling to tournaments every weekend. They're miserable. They hate each other because they're the only people they see. They're making payments like every week from now till dead. And all they've done is teach their kid to hate a sport they once loved. But no, that's dedication. That's looking out for your kid's best interest because maybe they'll get a scholarship. See what I'm saying? Like, we take fanatic out of church and it's celebrated. So why does it carry such a negative stigma inside the church? I'm willing to step out on a limb and make some people hate me maybe, and suggest that fanatics are just regular people who at one time or another, man, they tested God. They showed a little bit of faith, and they experienced His faithfulness. See, they figured out that being comfortable in the chairs wasn't nearly worth what being uncomfortable out on the limb was. They figured out that limb that feels like it's about to break is the safest place possible as long as God's called you there. And so they realized that when they accepted Christ as their Savior and they decided to follow Him, that meant a full reset. It meant wiping the slate clean and changing how you do everything. It meant understanding that a life of worship was the only acceptable life. I'm thinking maybe they look so fanatical because we've never done it ourselves. Maybe we're just too scared. So maybe they're right, and we're the fanatics for choosing to sit in the seat when we could experience God's faithfulness. So I want to describe a few characteristics that I see here of fanatical faith, because I really want to push us that direction. And the first of those, which this is the third point on your notes, is that fanatical faith believes big, but is willing to start small. You know, in emotion, we try to hammer home to our students that the craziest dreams you've got, they don't even touch the dreams and plans God's got for you. Not even close. And that's true for each of us. I imagine if you asked Pastor Brandon 8 years ago when he had 40 people in the church, if you told him we'd have 600-700 on a Sunday, he'd call you a liar. He'd say, man, there's no way I can see that. Now, if we had 40 or 50 people on a Sunday, I wouldn't have a job. I'd be looking somewhere else. But the reality is, big dreams start with small steps. I heard a pastor who is one of the leading pastors in America. He once said, your dreams only work when you do. And I look and I see God's vision for this army. He says, fill up this valley with ditches. And he says, once you start conquering Moab, cut down all the trees, block up all the springs, every good piece of ground, cover it with boulders. That's a lot of work. That's a big vision. But then I step back and I think, how'd they dig a ditch? They jump on the excavator and just start going to town? No, during this time frame, what they do, they picked up a shovel, started moving dirt one shovelful at a time. Fanatical faith, it dreams big, but it's willing to start small. Zechariah chapter 4 tells us that God celebrates to see the work begin. He celebrates the small things. Don't jump to the conclusion before the work starts. And this is just the way that I was raised, growing up on a farm, and just the work ethic that we had. We always believed anything worth having, you had to work hard for. You want to build something great, you start building the infrastructure. Whatever that may be. I'm thinking that the reason we don't get this is because somewhere along the line in church, the idea of having faith became a profession of your mouth. I believe God will do it, and then you sit and wait on it to happen. Folks, it takes no faith to be lazy. Zero. What it does take, faith works. Right? We like to take the verse from James where it says faith without works is dead and think, oh, that's a nice mental image. It's good. I can appreciate that. But I'm telling you, it's not an exaggeration. If your faith is not causing you to move and go and do, I'm going to suggest that you need an EKG because it's probably dead. It's probably rotting. It's probably gross. See, faith works. Faith doesn't stand around and wait. It lets God take your small movement and turn it into a miracle. And you're saying, man, that's like heretical. Like you're saying faith is not something I profess and this and that. Well, I want to walk you through just a few of Jesus' miracles just to point out where we're coming from. You can take the evidence of the guy with the shriveled hand. What's Jesus say to him? Reach out your hand. Right? Jesus could have done like this, and the guy's hand would have been healed. But what's he say? He said, I want to see you do your part. I'm going to do my part. I want to see if you trust me enough. Start. Show me something. You get a guy who's blind from birth. Jesus spits a loogie in the mud, makes mud, and wipes it on his eyes. That's gross. But then what's he say? Get up and walk to the pool and wash your eyes. Okay, I've done my part. Show me your faith. Go and do work. There's a guy who's been crippled from birth. He's laying on a mat. Jesus says, you're healed. Get up. The guy had to stand up on his own. Right? The thing about work is it takes a little bit of effort. I wonder if that's why so many of us refuse to be fanatical. We've never started and allowed ourselves to really experience what God can do with such a small start. We're trying to build a huge building here at New Life because our kids' ministry is booming, and that's awesome. But if we never take a step forward, we never try to start raising any money, we never start bringing in people to look at what the work is going to be, we never start cutting down trees, we never start bringing in dirt, we never start any of that, you know what it is? It's a dead vision with some expensive, pretty pictures. I'm afraid that looks like a lot of our faith. It started out strong, it started out great, but now it's just a centerpiece we hang out there when it's the right time in the right place, in the right location. I long for a church that has enough faith to chase big dreams in small, difficult, dirty steps. Because I believe that once you get in there and you get in the trenches and you get elbow deep in all the muck and the work, you're going to find out something else is true about fanatical faith. And that fanatical faith does things that seem counterproductive. They do things that seem wrong, counterintuitive. Like from the outside looking in, people are like, what in the world is going on? Like we said before, somebody's ready to call in the psychologist and have your brain analyzed. People are already ready to do that for me. Because I don't know about you guys, but I mowed my grass yesterday. Anybody else go outside yesterday? Didn't feel like you're about to die as soon as you walked outside? Drenched, like an hour, drenched. My father-in-law, he comes to first service, he puts in pools for a living. Man's like 75, 76 years old, still putting in pools. I helped him in college when I was in much better shape than I am now. And I know that when it's 100 degrees at ground level, it feels like about 120 in the hole. And you're thinking, what in the heck does it have to do with anything? Well, you got an army who's marched for 7 days. They're on the brink of death from dehydration. And what does God say? Go out in the heat of the day and dig some ditches. Like, that seems wrong to me. That seems like death, not life. Like, can we wait until like nighttime? It's cool. I can do it then. God says, no, go dig them now. See, that's the thing. Fanatical faith, it's going to do some things that go against common sense. Sometimes because God's just simply looking for us to demonstrate our trust in Him. It's going to do things that make zero sense. That like in all of your thought, you'd never go that way. You'd never head that way. But these guys grab their shovels, they tote them out in the sun, they start digging holes, right? It reminds me of the movie Holes. Everybody seen that? Like right in the middle of the day, use your shovel as a measuring stick, all that kind of stuff. That's what it makes me think of. In the middle of the sun. And see, it's funny because God even says, hey, I'm just going to continue this trend of going the wrong direction, if you will. Typically, when we see God indicate his presence, it's via an abundance of rain. 40 days and 40 nights of rain, right? I mean, that's just typically how it works. You're in the Middle East, you're in the desert. Rain is a scarcity. So God usually provides in that sense. But what does he say? He says, these pools will be full, and you won't see a drop of rain. He says, I'm going to give you water, and you're not going to see a drop of it. How in the heck is that going to work? Well, see, scholars have figured out that there's a mountain way off in the distance you can't even really see, and they say it rained on top of that mountain, and the only place the water ran was into that valley. Filled up those ditches. In fact, it was so awesome that the Moabites, they didn't even see it rain. They saw the sun shine off the rain. They assumed it was blood. They assumed everybody had snapped, and they were fighting each other. So they rushed down there to get a victory. And we'll come back to that in just a second. But I sort of began to think, where in my own life have I seen God work in counterproductive ways? And then God said, hey, just how about read your Bible? You'll find some. So I was thinking, Abraham and Isaac. Abraham, you're going to be a father of a great nation. Abraham, take your son and kill him. Wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. Right? Isaac is on a sacrificial altar, and Abraham has the knife up before something stops. It's all about trust. Or what about Peter? Peter hopping out of a boat and walking on a stormy ocean. That don't make sense to me. I don't get it. My imagination is Peter's probably I can't even swim. Evidenced by the fact that he sinks once he takes his eyes off God. Or maybe the biggest one to me, you've got Jesus hanging on the cross when he was supposed to save the world. That Friday, that doesn't look right. That doesn't look like salvation at all. It looks like defeat to me. Until 3 days later, Jesus raises from the dead and he says, hey, the way you thought I was going to save the world, that ain't the way I'm interested in doing it. I'm going to do it this way instead. See, God works in backwards ways all the time, ways that just don't make sense to us. But I'm afraid that we're missing out on all this, just simply because it doesn't make sense. That this type of counterproductive and counterintuitive action, this work that faith takes on a day in and day out basis, that our lives aren't focused on it, that we're not chasing after that. And I'm wondering if it's because for a lot of us, like I said earlier, we've never really stepped out enough on faith to experience the abundance of God's faithfulness. And that's our final point this morning. Fanatical faith experiences God's faithfulness. If you look, not only do you see that the army is taken care of, like we said, the Moabites, they rush in, and if you read the rest of the story, they're wrecked. They're destroyed. The entire nation is obliterated. So not only does God provide for what they ask, he provides a victory. He goes so much further, so much beyond anything that they can even assume. And I think God wants to do that in our own lives. He wants to say, I want to bless you beyond what you can imagine. Just show me a little faith. Just step out on that limb. Go a little bit beyond crazy and risk being labeled a fanatic. God's always faithful, without a doubt. Sometimes it's in ways we don't expect. And it's almost always to an extent greater than we can imagine. And a person of fanatical faith, I think they've experienced that. I think that's the big difference. I think that's why they're willing to look crazy. What I want to say this morning is stop waiting on things in the reverse order. Stop waiting on God's faithfulness while you live faithlessly. Begin to demonstrate a little faith. Begin to take small steps. I mentioned this in the first service, and I debated on bringing it up in the second service, but I feel like it's just such a perfect example. As we're all well aware, Wednesday evening, a young man walked into a church and shot 9 people at an AME Zion church in Charleston. And I don't know if you caught any of the bond hearing. I think it was on Friday. But via webcam, family members of those 9 people, they had a chance to talk with that young man during the bond hearing. And you know what they repeatedly said? It just blew my mind. We forgive you. They offer forgiveness. That's counterintuitive, folks. That's against the grain. That's taking a small step in faith. That's understanding God's faithfulness. That is fanatical faith. Now, you're probably wondering, like, man, we're almost at the end of service, and he hasn't mentioned a thing about fathers. Like, how does this apply to Father's Day? And while this is applicable to all of us, I really want to challenge and encourage dads this morning. If you want to foster this type of faith in your family, in your child, if you want to invite God's blessing, because I don't know any family who says, "No, God, I got it. I'm good. Don't need anything. We're all right." As leader of your household, you're going to have to learn to live this way. You're going to have to learn to follow this way. You know, one of my favorite quotes about student ministry, if you want your child to grow up a certain way, to train up a child in the way he should go, maybe you should travel that way yourself every once in a while. Don't be a parent who says, "Do what I say, not what I do." Be a parent who, like Paul, can say, "Hey, follow me while I try to do the right thing." Take this perspective home with you, because without you instilling it in your kids, they're not going to get it. They're not going to understand it. What I'm saying is, only God can send the rain, but sometimes he wants you to dig a ditch. Do some prep work. And I know you're busy between sports and work and, church and whatever else you guys have going on in your family. I get you're busy. What I'm asking you is, as part of your perspective, to reset your priorities and figure out what's important and what's not. Figure out where you're busy just for the sake of being busy. And I don't want to knock you down, because so many churches on Father's Day, they beat dads down and tell them everywhere they're failing. What I want to do is encourage and challenge you. I believe every dad in here can live up to this, especially with the support of other dads around them. So I want to encourage you to that this morning. I want to challenge you to get there. Because ultimately, all it's going to take is a few men willing to stand up and lead. All it's going to take is one Elisha, a guy who was looked down upon, who wasn't appreciated, and yet stood up in front of 3 worldly kings and demonstrated a big difference. The question is, are you willing to, as Andy Stanley defines faith, go out on a limb? Are you willing to risk something, most likely your reputation, in order to get to fanatical faith and experience God's faithfulness?